The GBA was supposed to be a platform for quick sessions and simple games. But I guess some titles didn't get the memo. Tactical RPGs with alignment systems that track every decision, strategy layers deep enough to support multiple playthroughs with completely different outcomes, and combat mechanics that would hold their own on any platform at any scale. The fact that they fit on a cartridge and you could play on a bus is almost beside the point. Advance Wars arrived back in 2001 as one of the GBA's launch titles in North America and immediately demonstrated that the handheld format was not a constraint for strategy games. It was an advantage. The pick-up and put-down structure of turn-based tactical combat was a natural fit for a portable screen, and intelligent systems used that fit to deliver a system of interlocking unit types, terrain advantages, and commanding officer powers that had more depth than most console strategy releases of the same year. The rock, paper, scissors foundation, infantry counter-tanks, counter-air, counter-infantry, is simple enough to grasp in the first few maps and complex enough that the late campaign missions and the competitive multiplayer demand genuine mastery. CO powers that charge through combat and deployment add a resource management layer above the unit-level decisions. And the specific CO you choose changes how aggressively or defensively you can play across different map types. Andy's balance stats play differently from Sammy's infantry focus or Max's direct combat power, and those differences are mechanical rather than cosmetic. The campaign has a lightness of tone, primary color armies, cartoon commanding officers, dialogue that treats war as a strategy game puzzle, that makes it accessible to players who would bounce off a more serious military presentation. That lightness is a deliberate design choice rather than a concession to the platform, and it doesn't limit the depth of what's underneath. Advance Wars is one of the clearest examples in gaming of a game that looks like what it isn't, and what it actually is rewards hundreds of hours of engagement. Onimusha Tactics is the GBA spin-off of Capcom's Samurai Action series, and it handles the transition from action to strategy more gracefully than franchise spin-offs usually manage. The feudal Japanese setting gives the unit roster a visual and thematic coherence that generic fantasy tactics games rarely achieve. Each unit class fits the period. The enemy designs come from the franchise's demon mythology rather than generic tactical RPG archetypes, and the aesthetic consistency makes the world feel like a place rather than a battle system with art attached. The Oni gauge system, where absorbed demon souls power, special attacks, and class-specific abilities, adds a resource management layer that creates decisions about when to spend accumulated power versus conserving it for harder encounters ahead. Unit leveling feeds into class promotions that branch in ways that create genuine roster planning questions, and the variety of terrain types in the mission design interacts with unit movement ranges in ways that make map reading a skill the game actually develops rather than assumes. The difficulty is more forgiving than the GBA tactics genre tends toward, which makes it a reasonable entry point for players new to the format, while limiting how much it demands from veterans. The story is thin by tactical RPG standards. The narrative was built for action games, and the adaptation doesn't develop the political complexity that the strategy format can support. Onimusha Tactics is a well-executed tactics game that uses its license well, without fully exploiting what the format could have done with the setting. Super Robot Tyson Original Generation is a GBA tactics game built around original mecha designs rather than licensed anime properties, which was the series' solution to the licensing nightmare that kept the mainline SRT games from reaching Western markets. What arrived was a tactics RPG with a roster of original mechs piloted by original characters, a story that took the super robot genre's tonal conventions seriously, and a combat system deep enough to support the obsessive unit customization that the series had built its reputation on in Japan. The Spirit Command system consumes SP to activate powerful one-turn effects, which adds a resource management layer above the standard movement and attack decisions. Managing which pilots have which spirits available, and when to use them versus conserving for later missions, creates a tactical depth that rewards knowing your roster rather than just your enemy. Pilots matter independently of their mechs in a way that most strategy RPGs don't engineer. The mech customization between missions where you are upgrading weapons, adding parts, assigning pilots, and it creates a metagame between battles that extends engagement well beyond the missions themselves. OG1 introduces enough original characters and story threads that it functions as a complete narrative rather than a sampler, and the anime presentation and attack animations, voice combat exchanges, communicates a scale that the GBA screen technically shouldn't be able to suggest. Super Robot Tyson Original Generation 2 picks up directly from the first game's conclusion and expands almost every system that OG1 established. More units, more pilots, more spirit commands, a larger cast of antagonists with actual ideological positions rather than just opposing faction labels, and a story that takes the emotional threads from the first game and pulls them toward consequences that the opening chapters wouldn't have suggested. The relationships which OG1 established becomes a narrative load-bearing element in ways that retroactively deepen what the first game was doing. The combat system refinements are incremental rather than revolutionary. The Spirit Command economy works the same way. The upgrade loop is familiar. The twin system for linking pilot pairs is expanded but not transformed. That continuity is the right choice for a direct sequel. They built something that worked, and the sequel's job is to fill it with more content of the same quality rather than restructure what was already functioning. The mission design gets more ambitious as the game trusts the player to have internalized OG1 systems, and the late-game scenarios push the roster in directions the first game's endgame didn't reach. The story's emotional escalation is where this surpasses its predecessor. The antagonist's motivation in the second half reframes the conflict in a way that makes the earlier missions feel like they were building towards something rather than filling time. It's as the rare sequel that makes the game before it better in retrospect while being better itself. And the pair of them together represent the best the original GBA SRT formula produced. Shining Force Resurrection of the Dark Dragon is a GBA remake of the 1992 Mega Drive original, and what it preserves and what it adds tell you exactly what Sega understood about why the original mattered. The grid-free movement system, where units move a fixed distance in any direction rather than along a square grid, gives Shining Force a spatial quality that most tactical RPGs don't have, and the remake keeps it intact while adding new characters, extended story sequences, and a harder difficulty mode that the original's balance hadn't needed to include. The promotion system, where units reach a level threshold and can be promoted into advanced classes that reset their level while dramatically expanding their capabilities, creates the most satisfying progression arc in the GBA Tactics library. Watching a character you've invested in transform from a standard fighter into something capable of clearing multiple enemies in a single turn, and knowing that the investment in the base class made the promotion more powerful, is a loop that the original designed impeccably and the remake preserves without alteration. The story has a warm simplicity that the remake's additional sequences expand rather than complicate. Shining Force was never a game with political ambiguity or narrative weight. It's a classic fantasy campaign about defeating evil with a party of friends, and the GBA version gives that premise the presentation it deserves without pretending it's something more sophisticated. The result is the most accessible tactical RPG on the GBA without sacrificing the mechanical depth that makes the Shining Force format worth returning to. Fire Emblem: The Sacred Stones was the first Fire Emblem game designed with a Western audience in mind, arriving in 2005 after the international success of the previous entry, and it used that awareness to introduce mechanics that lowered the barrier without reducing the ceiling. The world map structure of allowing free movement between fixed story chapters, with optional skirmishes and side dungeons available, gave players who struggled with mandatory permadeath a way to grind for levels and recover from losses. For veterans, those optional areas were irrelevant. For newcomers, they were the difference between finishing the game and abandoning it. The branching promotion system, where most units reach a fork at their promotion level and choose between two advanced classes with different stat distributions and skill sets, creates roster management decisions that matter across the full campaign. Choosing whether to promote Amelia into a general or a paladin isn't just a stat question. It's a question about what role she's going to play in your formation for the next 20 hours. That kind of meaningful choice within a single unit's development is something most strategy RPGs delegate to numbers rather than design. The dual protagonist structure gives the game genuine replayability at the story level rather than just the mechanical level. The game has a reputation among Fire Emblem players as the easiest entry in the series, which is true, and as a lesser entry because of that ease, which undersells it. Sacred Stones is the most complete package the GBA Fire Emblem games produced. Lufia the Ruins of Lore is the GBA entry in the Lufia series and the one that most players outside dedicated JRPG communities have never encountered, partly because it arrived in 2003 into a market that wasn't paying close attention to GBA RPGs, and partly because the Lufia series had already been fading from Western awareness since the SNES era. What it offers is a tactics-adjacent RPG where monster capture and synthesis create a companion system with more customization depth than the main character progression. You're building a party of synthesized creatures alongside the human cast, and the synthesis combinations that produce the strongest companions require planning that the game doesn't explain and rewards discovering. The tactical elements come through in the monster synthesis and the puzzle-forward dungeon design rather than through grid-based combat. Ruins of Lore is closer to a traditional JRPG with strategy RPG DNA than a pure tactics game, and that hybrid position is what makes it unusual enough to belong on this list. The dungeon puzzles, which use the monster abilities you've synthesized as tools for navigating obstacles, create a problem-solving layer that most JRPGs of the era treated as optional. Here it's the actual design. The game is short by RPG standards and ends before the synthesis system fully reveals its ceiling, which is the most significant frustration for players who engage deeply with the companion mechanics. The story is adequate rather than memorable, fitting the Lufia series tradition of competent fantasy narrative without the emotional weight of the best entries. Ruins of Lore is a game worth finding for what it does differently, with the understanding that what it does conventionally is merely acceptable. Zone of the Enders: The Fist of Mars is the game in a franchise known for spectacular action that chose instead to become a strategy RPG, and the choice works in ways that the franchise's mainstream audience completely missed. Grid-based tactical combat organized around the franchise's orbital frames gives the mech designs a weight and a consequence that the PS2 action game's speed prevented. Positioning your units for flank attacks, managing the facing mechanic that makes attack angle a genuine tactical variable, commanding squads across maps where the objective isn't always to destroy everything. These are systems that the action franchise couldn't accommodate and the strategy format handles completely. The narrative is where the Fist of Mars makes its strongest case. A civilian caught in a Martian independence conflict isn't the power fantasy protagonist the franchise had established, and the political complexity of what he's caught in. Factions with genuine competing claims, betrayals that make sense within their own logic, deaths that arrive without narrative preparation, gives the strategy format material that action games rarely bother with. The writing takes the science fiction setting seriously in ways the PS2 games didn't need to. Some maps drag once the patterns become readable, and the difficulty curve has moments where the gap between easy and hard missions feels less designed than accidental. The GBA hardware limits what the combat can show at scale. You're constructing the spectacle in your head rather than seeing it. Neither issue undermines what the Fist of Mars achieves as a strategy game built in an action franchise's shadow, and what it achieves is substantial enough to deserve a much wider audience than it found. Tactics Ogre the Knight of Lodis is the GBA prequel to one of the most celebrated tactical RPGs ever made, and it carries the series' moral weight without the full quest engine underneath it. The alignment system, tracking your in-battle decisions to shift your character between lawful, neutral, and chaotic, affects which units will work with you, which story paths open, and what equipment becomes accessible. The game is watching how you fight, not just whether you win, and it adjusts what's available to you based on what it sees. The class and emblem systems give the roster management layer genuine depth. Emblems, passive ability modifiers that attach to specific class conditions, require planning your unit's career several promotions ahead to achieve the combinations worth having. A unit built toward a specific advanced class with a specific emblem plays meaningfully differently from the same base class without that preparation. And discovering the emblem system's depth is the kind of thing that turned a first playthrough into a research project that informs the second. The story is darker than the GBA library typically went, and the narrative weight earns the tactical decisions rather than existing separately from them. Some of the late maps have difficulty spikes that feel less designed than accumulated, and the pacing in the middle chapters loses some of the momentum the opening builds. Neither diminishes what the Knight of Lodis achieves as a handheld tactics game. It asks more of you than almost anything else on the platform and delivers more in return. Igdri Union Will Never Fight Alone came out at the end of the GBA's commercial lifespan and found almost no audience because the platform was already being left behind. What it contained was one of the most mechanically original strategy RPGs the format ever saw. A card-based battle system where the battle card you select each turn determines your movement range, your attack type, and the tactical options available to your units. Resource management at the card level sits above the positioning layer, and both have to be managed simultaneously across every turn. The difficulty is real and earns its reputation. Losing a unit means losing that unit, and the morale system, where units pushed below a threshold become temporarily unusable, adds a pressure layer that makes engagements feel consequential in ways that health bars alone don't achieve. The terrain interactions, the specific card unit synergies that reward building your deck around a coherent strategy, the way certain enemy types require specific counters. All of it comes together in a system that takes multiple playthroughs to understand fully. The story is the other thing that separates it from a pure tactics exercise. A princess leading a liberation army while the war steadily degrades everyone fighting it, including her, is a darker arc than most GBA games attempted, and the game doesn't resolve it comfortably. Igdri Union is the kind of game that the right player finds once and doesn't forget, and the wrong player finds confusing and frustrating without ever understanding why either response is happening. Rebel Star Tactical Command carries Julian Gollop's name and design philosophy into the GBA era. And what that means in practice is a tactics game that treats the genre with the seriousness of a wargame simulation rather than the accessibility of a JRPG. The creator of the original XCOM built a squad-based resistance campaign against an alien occupation where permanent death means permanent death, where Overwatch positioning determines whether you survive the enemy's turn, and where a single bad decision in Mission 3 can create a cascade of difficulty across the next 5 missions. The action point system, where each unit has a pool of points spent on movement, firing, and ability use across their turn, creates a granularity of decision-making that most GBA tactics games simplify in a move and attack binary. How far you move matters because it determines how many APs remain for shooting. Whether you fire once or twice matters because it determines how exposed you are to return fire. Every decision within a unit's turn involves reading the remaining AP budget against the tactical situation, and that constant calculation is the game's actual mechanical depth. The campaign builds in ways that reward investment. Early missions that seemed straightforward become templates for understanding what the game is asking of you when the later missions remove the margins. The presentation is modest. Rebel Star looks exactly like what it is, a GBA game made without a large budget, and the story exists primarily as scenario connective tissue rather than genuine narrative. What it offers instead is design from someone who has been thinking about this specific type of game longer than almost anyone alive, and that depth shows in every mission.